Hi there, I'm Carla of Cacao with Carla, and I'm going to show you how to make the perfect cup of cacao using your Keats cacao. So what you need for this is going to be, of course, a chopping board and a way to, chop up your cacao. I've got my preferred sweetener here, which is just maple syrup that you can get at Trader Joe's, probably any other store that you go to. And for spicing, I have some cayenne pepper, some Redmond salt because they have the best salt, lots of minerals in that, some cinnamon, and also something I like to add in my particular brew is maca powder. So maca powder is really good for energy. It's also really great for sex drive, so energy on multiple levels. And also something else that I really highly recommend is having a blender. If you have a blender for your cacao, it's gonna make your cacao nice and fluffy and have a really, really great consistency. I also have my electric kettle because it just makes boiling water a lot easier. But that's actually gonna be the first thing we're talking about, is that you actually don't want to use boiling water for your cacao, because that'll actually scorch all of the good stuff that's in the cacao, and you'll end up having a really bitter cup of cacao, and also the serotonin producing properties won't be preserved with that. So the first thing you're gonna do when you get your pound of cacao, just gonna unwrap it, and you can kind of do what I do sometimes, just like cut the whole thing, like just cut through the bag, but you can also unwrap it first. So when you get your cacao, it's going to look like this. So as you've probably heard me say before, unpasteurized cacao has its cocoa butter or cacao butter completely intact. So that's what that lighter stuff is that you see when you open your bar of cacao. That's just the natural process that chocolate goes through when it's not been tempered. And tempering is just when they heat and cool the cacao over and over again to stop it from doing that process. That way, when you buy a candy bar, you're not getting like something that's kind of, different consistencies all over. So again, this is what it looks like when you open it. I'm just gonna see if it can focus a little better there. So that is the cacao on the inside there. I'm gonna refocus it here. Whoops, go away, okay. So the first thing to remember with cacao and storing it properly is that you wanna put it in something nice and airtight. So there's already cacao in here from my previous block of cacao. Having something nice and airtight is going to be the best option for you. So whether you decide to just, cut into it but not cut the whole thing up and put it in a Ziploc bag, that's actually how I started off doing it before I had one of these. But I really highly recommend something as airtight as possible. Just giving you another little look at this cacao here. It's really beautiful. I love it. So I'll leave it open. And maybe I'll edit this part to where I'm chopping a lot faster. And for the sake of brevity, actually, I'm just gonna, for this video, chop up a little bit of this and not the whole bar, so you don't have to watch that whole thing. So I'm chopping it nice and fine. It doesn't have to be like, powder fine or anything like that. So I'm making it maybe, not super, super fine. Just, that's about as fine as I'm making it right there. So you don't have to get it super tiny. Also, if you're using a blender, that's another reason I like using a blender, because it's gonna allow you a lot more leeway with like not having to chop it like super, super small. Whereas if you're just using like a pot of hot water and a whisk, that might pose a few more challenges for you. So I'm gonna put some of this in here And I'm gonna make about, actually I'm just gonna make one dose. So for a typical dose, it's 1 ounce of cacao per like a regular dose. But if you're making your ceremonial dose, you wanna use at least 1.5 to 2 ounces of cacao. And especially for you very detail-oriented people out there, and Virgos especially, who may be like, okay, what does an ounce of cacao look like? I'm actually not someone who measures very often, so I've just been eyeing it, honestly. So for me, this is about what I would use for 1 dose. Like that amount right there is what I would use. So I kind of want to just make 2 doses, because whenever I make a ceremonial dose of cacao, I make a second one if I'm doing ceremony, so that I can actually use one of the doses as an offering for ancestors, for different kind of deities that you want to work with. This is a really great type of offering that you can use for that, if that feels resonant for you. So again, for doses, for those who want to measure and you have a little, scale or anything, 1 ounce is just a regular dose. 1.5 ounces to 2 ounces is what you use for a ceremonial dose. And I'm just going to put a little bit extra in there, because the more you use, the thicker it's going to be. Of course, you want to, to experiment and see how the cacao feels in your body before you just like start making a huge amount. So this is why, especially if you're watching this after purchasing a cacao ceremony, group ceremony ticket, this will be really great for you to actually use your cacao ahead of time before the ceremony to determine what kind of consistency and thickness and how much of the cacao you can have in your body and feels good without it being overwhelming. So we've got that. And so for the sake of brevity, I have already heated my water. So the first thing about cacao, I'm gonna bring it back up to my face so you're not just looking at my hands. So the biggest thing with cacao is that you do not want to use boiling water. If you use boiling water, it will come out scorched. It'll be bitter, and that is not what you want. So when I say hot but not boiling, I mean, like, let's see, with this, I could stick my finger in and it would, it would be hot, but it wouldn't be like scalding hot, like kind of almost like it's hot enough for me to keep my finger in, but I can still recognize that it's hot. And I have a really low heat tolerance, so, that's really saying something. If you try to use water that's not quite hot enough, it's not going to fully, just the consistency of the cacao is not going to come out very well. So I'm just putting a little bit of my my cayenne in here, because I love adding cayenne to my cacao. And you can add a fair amount of it before it starts to get like super dry hot. It's very forgiving about that. Also, if you use cayenne, it actually helps the theobromine uptake, and it helps you feel the theobromine and all the other properties of the cacao even more intensely. So if that's something that you're looking for, you can also use the cayenne for that as well. And now I'm gonna add a bit of my maca powder for energy and keeping my lady parts happy and juicy. So we're gonna do a little of that. And again, I don't measure things, I just do it completely intuitively. So I hope this is not driving you crazy watching right now. So I'm gonna add a bit of cinnamon. And again, this is why I like it. I like it when you experiment with it and see what works for you best. Then also adding some of that Redmond salt. So adding a bit of salt in the cacao is really nice. It really just helps, it brings out more of the flavors. So yeah, I didn't really go over that, but the reason that the cacao looks like this again is because of the cacao butter. So one of the big things that a lot of people will do when they first get cacao is that they'll try to make it with like nut milk, like hemp milk or coconut milk, because a lot of us grew up with like Swiss Miss, and who made Swiss Miss with water if you had the choice of using water or milk? Like a lot of us use milk, right? Because we wanted it to be creamy. This is a lot of fat already. So you do not need to add anything else to make this creamy. And in fact, if you do want to use like a nut milk, like I'm very partial to hemp milk, it's really great. You want to use the hot water first, because if you use the nut milk has a lower boiling point, which means it's not going to get quite hot enough to allow the cacao to melt. So it's going to kind of come out really chunky and weird. It's not going to mix well at all. So believe me, it may be counterintuitive, but use hot water first and then add some splashes of nut milk later. Very important. So now I'm gonna add my sweetener. So this is gonna be my maple syrup. And again, I don't measure anything. I would probably say this is like 1.5 tablespoons per serving, and I'm sort of making like 2 super dank servings right now, so add a little bit more of that. And so this brings me to my other thing. A lot of people, what they'll do when they first get cacao and they're trying to figure out what to sweeten it with, they'll automatically go to honey. And the thing with honey is that the point that you need to heat honey for it to melt and like really mix well with the cacao, and the temperature where it scorches is it's like the same. So it's almost impossible to get it hot enough to where it really mixes well with the cacao without burning it. The number one thing I get from people, they're like, oh my gosh, my cacao came out bitter. I always ask, did you use boiling water? And the second question is, did you use honey? Because 9 times out of 10, if you didn't use hot water, it's bitter because you used honey, and the honey got scorched, but the cacao came out at the right temperature, and the cacao isn't actually bitter, it's just the honey. Plus, the flavor profile of maple syrup mixes really well with the flavor of cacao, especially Keith's cacao and all the other cacaos that I have tried. So it's really the way to go, like flavor profile, consistency, all of the things. All right, so now this is pretty self-explanatory and straightforward. You're gonna add your water. So with a ceremonial dish, you have your 1.5 to 2 ounces of cacao per serving for a ceremonial serving, and you want to use about maybe 7 to 8 ounces of liquid. So of course, just like with ratios, the more liquid you use, the thinner consistency the cacao is going to be. So you really just want to play with this as well. Some people prefer using less cacao, or less liquid to cacao ratio to make it even thicker. Some people prefer using more liquid so they can just kind of savor it. So if you're like doing like a more daily practice with your cacao, feel free to use like 8 ounces or even more if you want to, for like maybe 1 ounce of cacao, because if you are drinking it more regularly, you want to drink a less amount of it. So this is where this comes in. So just as simple as that. I'm gonna scooch this over here, scooch this over here. This is very organized and such when you just have your flow and you've got everything going. So I've got these smaller cups here. These cups are about 6 ounces each. So I'm just going to use these smaller cups so you can have more visuals of what the cacao looks like. So right off the bat, this is already a lot thicker and has a lot of froth on it. So again, if you were listening before and you're like, oh well, I have to use an extra cream, I have to use extra fat, I have to use coconut, you actually don't, because again, this cocoa butter has not been removed from the cacao because it's completely natural. Nothing's been removed from it. So you get this nice, beautiful look here. So I'm gonna just turn it around briefly. So that is the consistency, whoops. That is the consistency of the cacao. Like, look at that. I bet you've never had this with, cacao powder, Navitas powder, anything like that. So again, you watched me make it. This is just using water, and I've got this beautiful, nice, thick froth on top. So, again, that is how you make a cup of cacao. So if you have any questions, feel free to message me and I will be glad to troubleshoot with you. The two main things are don't use honey and use, actually three things, don't use honey, use hot water but not boiling water, and don't use your nut milk as the initial base. Always use hot water first and add your nut milk later. Because even as you're like heating up your nut milk separate from the water, you'll notice that it's gonna start like bubbling before your water does. And again, that's because it has a lower boil point. So this is just where you enjoy.